Welcome back to the Everything VR and AR podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Pettyjohn, and today I'm honored to have on the show Mike Boland. Mike is the founder and chief analyst at Artillery. Artillery is an emerging analyst firm covering the augmented reality and virtual reality space. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks for having me. Big fan of the show. I've been listening since the first episode, which I think was Verzoom. Was that what it was?
I believe you're right. We're running up on 70 episodes now, so that's pretty amazing. Hopefully you've listened to every one.
Is there confetti falling from the ceiling in the studio there?
You win a prize reward that we'll send to you in the mail. How does that sound?
Nice. Excellent.
So, Mike, I know you've been covering this space since almost the beginning. You've been an analyst for many years covering the digital space, but maybe you could talk just a little bit about why did you form Artillery? What is its mission? And what gets you really excited about it?
So quick background is the last 15 years or so, I've been an industry analyst. And part of that at the beginning, I was a tech journalist, and then I sold out to the analyst corps. But the majority of that time, I was an industry analyst. And analysts, as you know, are kind of defined by their coverage area. So my coverage area was mobile, and I kind of did that through the kind of smartphone era. And around 2014, right around the time that Facebook bought Oculus, I really started to get excited about immersive technologies, VR, AR. So I started to migrate my coverage over to those areas, and they very much relate to mobile and smartphones, as we're going to go over today. And then that really accelerated in late 2015. It was in LA. I remember this very well, where a guy by the name of Nathan Pettyjohn approached me and asked me if I wanted to get involved in the VR&AR Association. And of course I said yes, and that really kind of accelerated my immersion into the space. And it all kind of culminated about 6 months ago when I decided to go all in and actually quit my day job and start Artillery. So as you mentioned, it is an analyst firm. I like to think of it as a publication and an intelligence firm. So the publication side, I'm doing daily insights, weekly newsletter, monthly reports, lots of multimedia, video interviews, stuff like that. And then the intelligence side is a lot of data and white papers. And, you can think of it like the Gartner of AR, though obviously not as big quite yet. But that's kind of how to think of it conceptually.
Okay. And, I've got to say I've been really impressed with the initial reports that you've put out in the marketplace, so keep them coming. Every time I see it hit, I get a surge of adrenaline, literally. And we should also mention that you're the co-chapter president of the San Francisco chapter of the VR&AR Association, right?
Yeah, and a lot of exciting things happening there. We're doing events. The membership continues to grow. It's lots of fun just kind of seeing and supporting the industry growth through the lens of all of our members. I mean, it's an exciting time.
Excellent. Well, let's dive into the main subject matter of this show. Today we're going to be talking about the impact that Apple is going to have on the augmented reality industry with the launch of iOS 11, which will include the recently announced AR kit. So, Mike, I'm really interested in your take on AR kit, and what is this going to do for the industry, and what is it going to make possible for the whole industry?
Well, it's really going to accelerate things, first of all. So as background, AR kit, I think, really democratizes what we all refer to as true AR. We've seen lots of things labeled as AR, but really they're just kind of two-dimensional overlays, and that's things like Pokemon Go and Snapchat selfie lenses, which we can kind of circle back to. But true AR has graphical overlays that are dimensionally accurate to the physical world that you're looking at. So it's graphics that can, move behind trees or sit on top of a table with dimensional accuracy. And this is all known as simultaneous localization and mapping, or SLAM. So ARKit has come along and essentially made SLAM much more accessible. And it's done that in two ways. And one is by taking some of those like area mapping and depth sensing capabilities that are required for SLAM and accomplishing that through software as opposed to hardware. So right out of the gate, ARKit is compatible with lots of existing iPhones, as opposed to something like Google Tango, which requires, specific hardware and camera optics to get that kind of depth sensing. And then the second thing that ARKit did was it packaged all of that up and handed it over to the massive iOS developer community, and it made it a lot easier for them to kind of just run with it and do cool things. And we've seen several examples come out of the woodwork since the public beta was launched recently, and we're going to see a lot more cool stuff in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it. So, Mike, we've seen over the past couple of years virtual reality have a lot of buzz in the media. Recently, with Apple's AR kit, we've seen more and more talk about augmented reality. We've had companies like Blipper raised recently $54 million in a Series D of financing back in March. But Apple is going to have such a significant impact, as you've already talked about. Take us through the numbers, the scale that Apple is going to create just by launching ARKit on the iPhone, the iPad. I know you've done a lot of research into this, so can you walk us through kind of how you derived these numbers you've already produced in some of your reports?
I think it's really important to quantify it to really back up the claim that everyone's saying that, ARKit creates the biggest AR development platform overnight because of that compatibility with lots of existing iPhones. So what I sought to do was to quantify what is that installed base of existing iPhones. And what I discovered was there are about 380 million today globally ARKit compatible iPhones. That's going to grow to about 500 million by the end of this year, and then 850 million by 2020. And that's just iPhones. I'm going to do a separate calculation for iPads. And in terms of the methodology for arriving at those figures, just to provide a little bit of credibility behind the figures, at a high level, the way one would go about that is essentially, you want to look at the fact that ARKit's compatible with phones with A9 chips or greater, which is essentially the iPhone 6S or greater. I looked at the unit sales of all of those phones to get a cumulative installed base of devices today, then also taking into account variables like iPhone replacement cycles, which today are about 2.5 years. So by this time next year, most activated iPhones will be compatible, and the non-ARKit compatible phones will kind of slowly cycle out.
Right. So the scale is massive. So, Mike, what industries are likely to be the top 2-3 areas for augmented reality that are going to leverage Apple's new AR kit?
First of all, it's good to separate consumer and enterprise. I think that the timeline to adoption for kind of mass adoption on the consumer side is a bit further off. In the enterprise, I think it's going to be sooner because the barriers to adoption aren't as high. So one, you have kind of a discernible and a tangible ROI story that enterprises can get behind. For example, in things like manufacturing and assembly, it can improve worker efficiency by 25%, according to Google. And then also, very importantly, the stylistic barriers that are kind of one of the barriers to adoption in the consumer world, because you're asking people to kind of put things on their face. That isn't as present in the enterprise world because, you're at work. It's not expected to be a fashion statement in that context. Now, in terms of like verticals, I think that retail is going to be huge. I think, from the consumer's perspective, it's directional navigation to find, obscure items at Home Depot and saving time. And, it's other stuff like product information you can see in real time and comparative prices. It's basically showrooming 2.0. But also from the retailer's perspective, and also I would lump in their brand advertisers, it's better attribution data to tie back to their marketing campaigns to see what's working and what's really driving in-store sales, because you have a whole new set of analytics of kind of tracking people and what they're looking at all the way down to the cash register. And, that's been, as you know, Nathan, like the holy grail of local advertising for over a century. And we often forget that, offline brick and mortar is 90% of U.S. retail spending. So I think it's a massive opportunity in, consumer impact, but also in dollars. And I think it's interesting to note, too, that not just physical retail, but e-commerce. We see a lot of retailers like Wayfair and others let you kind of superimpose through an AR interface furniture kind of in your home to make a more informed purchase. And Amazon is all over this. We saw what Amazon did with the Amazon Look, which is that creepy device that's in your closet and essentially takes full-length pictures. And I think that's kind of a not fully formed vision, but kind of halfway there towards some kind of e-commerce assisted AR experiences. But more practically, one thing that Amazon is doing that I love that isn't really talked about a lot is that they're starting to let people kind of superimpose large items like a flat screen TV on the wall just to make sure it fits. That one makes a more informed purchase, and they've been able to prove that that boosts kind of basket sizes and conversions. But number two, Amazon is a company that is obsessed with their margins, and their margins are razor thin. And one thing that decimates those those razor thin margins is returns of big bulky items. They've been actually able to reduce returns by that more informed purchase of people knowing that it fits because they did that AR guided process of kind of superimposing the TV on the wall or wherever it's going to go. And then in terms of verticals, number 2, the second one I'll mention is, and I mentioned this briefly, manufacturing and assembly. I spoke with a company the other day and did a profile on Artillery about them. It's called Scope AR, and they essentially provide software for remote workers to get either human-guided or automated assembly or maintenance instructions through a graphical overlay on their field of vision. And they utilize existing hardware like HoloLens or ODG glasses, and they're kind of the software layer. And it's interesting because, again, the benefits there are worker productivity and reduced mistakes and less downtime. When you have high volume manufacturing facilities, they often have to kind of switch the lines for new fabrication, for new parts, and that's downtime. They've been able to prove it drastically reduces downtime. And then lastly, in situations where there's kind of like human guided support, which is what Scope AR does, there's a remote expert kind of telling the on-site professional what to do, but they can see the exact same thing that professional sees and can make real-time graphical annotations about, pull that lever and turn that screw and stuff like that. And what I love about that is it's like the same value proposition that companies like WebEx have been saying for years about, reducing travel costs and all that, but just the more immersive version. And I, for one, can't wait for this purely for selfish reasons, for things like helping my mom with anything technology related, which, if you've ever done that before over the phone with verbal instructions is, one of the most frustrating things in the world. But, there's going to be fun, there's going to be practical use cases. But I think that those two, manufacturing, assembly, and retail, are the verticals where we're going to see just a lot of, awesome stuff done.
I like your take on that, and it makes a lot of logical sense. The other vertical that I'm hoping we can dive into just a little bit is AR mobile gaming. And I think at Apple's recent developer conference, they had a demo that was done by this company called Wingnut AR. And Wingnut AR, I believe, is run by Peter Jackson, who is part of the Lord of the Rings franchise. So it looked absolutely amazing. It was kind of like this 3D story/game. But how do you see the gaming world evolving into the AR mobile ecosystem?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of cool stuff created. And I think that it's interesting. When you look at kind of transformations in form factors and technology, the ones that are most successful are the ones that build things that what I like to call native thinking. So it takes into consideration all of the unique aspects of the device, of the new technology, and builds around that instead of shoehorning kind of a legacy format. So I think that the most successful games, or any apps for that matter, are going to be the ones that kind of build very cool, novel experiences that we've never seen before. Now, I think in terms of the business models around gaming, I've been looking at that, and I mentioned the app economy earlier. I think, some of the evolution of mobile AR and the business models that are around it, including gaming, I think are going to map to what we saw over the last 10 years in the smartphone era. I don't think you're going to see a lot of upfront app sales. There certainly will be some really compelling experiences that people will pay for, but I think it'll unfold in a few ways. Anything gaming related will likely involve in-app payments for kind of in-game achievements, and the kind of ARPU, or average revenue per user, is much higher in in-app payments as opposed to upfront purchases. I think that for brands, I think some of them might get involved in these types of experiences, whether they be kind of gamified experiences around their marketing strategies. I think that'll be one kind of example of the kind of novel and native approaches, as opposed to things like, banner ads and traditional advertising. Right. So I think that we're going to see a lot of stuff created there. And the most successful examples are going to be the ones that are native. And two quick examples of things that were native in the smartphone era, instead of just taking, legacy media and putting it on a smaller screen. We saw this kind of flowering of innovation around 2008 when the App Store came out, and we can expect to see that from this point forward with ARKit in terms of the magnitude of kind of creativity and impact. And then that'll eventually get to things like Uber or Snapchat or Pokemon Go, or the versions of that amount of creativity with this new tool. And I think that's very much going to be applied to the gaming world, more than anything else, in terms of the immersiveness and the ability to kind of play with and utilize the canvas of the physical world around us within that gameplay. I think that's going to be really compelling to watch.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the banner ad, the feared banner ad, interrupting that user experience. But when we saw Apple's first iPhone launch, there, and the touchscreen smartphone in general, there was a massive surge in banner ads that were primarily designed to get you to download other apps. The gaming industry really jumped onto this. We saw Google and Apple both acquire companies for massive sums of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, to start running mobile banner ads. And if we look at augmented reality, are we going to see another version of that take place, like a different type of banner ad? And I hope to God that it's a better user experience than the banner ad. But how do you see that evolving, or is it too early to tell?
I think it goes back to the concept of like native thinking. I think, advertisers can do so much in terms of transforming the creative, given this new, what is essentially a creative tool. And one thing that was kind of lost in the mobile era was that ads became a lot more utilitarian. And a lot of the creativity went away if you compare that to the previous generation of ads in things like magazine advertising and the kind of Mad Men era of that kind of like creative ad. A lot of the luster kind of went away when you have this little like rectangle, this like 320 by 50 rectangle, right? On the mobile device, we started to see that change. Like I said, things like Snapchat stories, I think, have been successful in terms of just kind of building it around the capabilities of the device. But with AR now, I think it's a really important opportunity to transform the creative and the brand experience and build these kind of compelling things that are maybe more about, immersive opportunities with kind of product experiences. And I think that the classic example of what not to do is like the early days of TV ads. We saw this play out where the format was essentially a guy standing there reading a script in front of the camera. And that's simply because that's the way it was done in radio. It's, again, that kind of native thinking. It's hard to belabor that point, but I think it's important when we're going into these ad formats. And, when we moved into the smartphone era, we saw that concept play out with a lot of just kind of like things that were ported over from the desktop. And the more successful formats broke out of that mold. And again, that's things like Snapchat stories and branded lenses and geo filters and the cool things they're doing. And it's funny that it's taken, 10 years after the initial iPhone came out to really build that like truly native ad format that works on this small screen. So the translation into the advent of AR of how advertisers should be looking at this is to build kind of rich formats from scratch again. But, I think, for example, pre-roll video ads won't work. That rectangle 320 by 50 banner ad won't work. The whole point, as we talked about earlier with SLAM and the dimensional mapping, is for dimensionally accurate overlays and the real world. And the real world doesn't happen in neat little squares the way that a 2D screen does. So I think it's going to have to be, different formats. It might be some iteration on the banner to answer your question, but I think it'll just be more immersive and hopefully take advantage of that interactivity, dimensionally accurate mapping, and really bring some sort of branded or sponsored experience rather than just like a tangible little kind of square or rectangle. And I think, we're going to see people do that. I think most of the ad world will be kind of stuck in their ways. I think Madison Avenue is kind of one of the slowest and stodgiest industries on the planet, but some will get it right. And I think they're going to build truly compelling ad creative that'll be natural and creative and native to the medium. And it could be back to the concept of games. There could be AR games that feature a product. It could gamify the route to a store for a fitness brand by tracking your fitness achievements as you run, to the store to get a Gatorade. Stuff like that that's more experiential, I think, are the things we're going to see resonate most.
As we look at this, and you mentioned, spatial scanning and the ability of these devices to start doing 3D mapping and scanning, layering in object recognition and artificial intelligence, which we've heard so much from Apple, from Google, and Facebook, and the list goes on. Are we going to see that every iPhone now is passively scanning and doing object recognition in real time to start overlaying more detailed content? Or are you thinking Apple is going to take a little different path to that experience?
So I think that it's not going to be pervasively scanning. I think Apple is a company like Facebook and like Google and major tech giants that are constantly under pressure and scrutiny of privacy concerns. So I think that the degree to which the camera is kind of active and scanning is going to be limited, not just for privacy reasons, but for battery and processing and other reasons. And it's going to be probably confined to when it's kind of in use by apps that choose to utilize ARKit and tap into it. And I think we haven't seen this yet, but I think what's going to happen is we can look towards some of the other capabilities that iPhone has and how they've handled that as a model for what they're going to do there. You know, background location tracking is an example where sometimes it's on while the app is in use. So I think it's going to be at the ARKit kind of app layer of the stack where the app taps into that functionality in the phone, in the hardware, especially as we see more kind of advanced stereoscopic optics come into the new iPhone. So it's going to tap into that capability, and that's kind of what's going to govern that whole system of when and how they're utilizing that capability to do that mapping.
Yeah. Yeah, you make a good point there. So let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about two other companies that they both leverage Apple's App Store, yet many view as competing directly with what ARKit is going to be offering. So it's a very unique ecosystem that's evolving. Those two companies I'm talking about are Snapchat and Facebook. And the reason being, Snapchat offers, I think, what they call filters that have become extremely popular amongst people using. And they've even started layering in augmented reality inside the room when you're taking snaps. And then Mark Zuckerberg announced at Facebook's F8 conference this year their camera effects platform, which not only allows you to layer on stickers and filters, but actually doing, AR type of elements that look pretty darn similar to what we've seen with ARKit. So can you talk a little bit about how you see this ecosystem evolving? I mean, is Facebook going to end up killing their camera effects platform and saying, hey, let's just have everybody go with ARKit? It's an interesting dynamic that's going to start to evolve. So I'd love your perspective on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Snapchat, I mean, I'm glad you brought them up here because they kind of started all of this with selfie lenses and filters. Unfortunately, Instagram has kind of copied them wholesale on many of the features, stories, and other things, and that includes this. And it's kind of really cannibalizing a lot of Snapchat's usage, but they do deserve credit for kind of coming up with a lot of these selfie lenses and things that, again, aren't really true AR, but it doesn't matter. I think it's still played an important part of the ecosystem as a proof point or a proof of concept that this really does have mass appeal. So I think Snapchat, they made a tactical misstep in their very kind of closed off and kind of protective product culture where, everything has to be perfect and they do everything in-house. So that development muscle to kind of build all of those kind of AR creative components can only scale so far when you talk about their internal team. So you end up with only a handful of lenses. So Facebook, what they did when they came along with camera effects, as you mentioned, is not only a better technology for selfie filters because they're utilizing SLAM, but it created an open platform. So now you get like hundreds or even thousands of filters instead of the tens that Snapchat can create. And it's not just filters, importantly, but lots of other use cases that I think the third-party developer ecosystem will get creative with. So, the example that's often used is like leaving notes for your friends in physical places and other kind of social use cases that kind of essentially keep you using Facebook, which is kind of their goal. But then that brings us full circle to ARKit. And Apple, when they kind of came up with ARKit, they went even one step further and one-upped Facebook by creating an even better kind of more capable SLAM-oriented development kit for AR features and apps. But also I think what's important there is they have a bigger development network and one whose use cases I think will be a lot more varied than the socially oriented use cases that I think we're going to see with camera effects and within kind of Facebook's walled garden. So in breadth and in depth, I think ARKit beats Facebook. And then also, I think that the advantage Apple has there is they're vertically integrated. They own the hardware, they own the operating system, and now they own the app layer. And Facebook is no slouch. They have, 2 billion global users. They have a rich development community. But I think Apple is going to beat Facebook. And when I say beat, I'm not talking in absolute terms. I think Facebook will coexist in this world, but I think Apple has an edge just based on how they're positioned.
Yeah. Are there any numbers currently that are out there on the number of developers that are building on the camera effects platform?
Yeah, that's a good question. I bet that number does exist. I don't have it handy. But yeah, it's essentially the size of, well, the addressable market there, not necessarily using camera effects, but those that can. The best thing to do there is look at the current universe of Facebook developers, which is fairly large.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other alternative that we could look at playing out in the marketplace, I'm not saying it will, but is Facebook to launch their own phone. We've heard about this in the past. There's been rumors that they started developing this. They decided not to launch it. But it starts to get a little more interesting when you think of it through Oculus and the Oculus VR system. We've seen Zuckerberg talk about 10 years down the road, we're going to have headsets that are VR and AR capable, and those could very well be Facebook glasses. So where is this going? What do you think?
Yeah. So the concept of like a Facebook phone, you're right. That's been coming up time over the years to get that vertical integration that Apple enjoys and to kind of own the end user and the actual physical touch point. And they've kind of adamantly said over and over again, whenever asked, we're not interested in building a phone. I think in this situation, it might not make sense for them to do so because I think that they see the kind of eventual mass ubiquity and ubiquity in historical terms when there's a really rich and healthy ecosystem is when you get to about 100 million units sold. VR headsets right now are at about 17, 18 million units sold, and a lot of those are cardboard and Gear VR. But in terms of, Oculus eventually knowing they need to get, and Facebook by extension, knowing they need to get to that day, they realize that that's probably 4 to 5 years away in terms of that like 100 million units install base ubiquity. I think they're currently putting a lot of muscle behind camera effects as really kind of a stepping stone to that day. So I think that they're going to stay with a software-based approach to kind of build these AR-based social sharing experiences, on the backs of the network that they currently have and utilizing that massive network effect. But the thing is, if they were to come out with a phone, they would really have to commit to a lot in terms of, support for whoever bought the phone and versioning over time. It would be hard for them to phase out. It's much harder to phase out a hardware product than it is a software product. And I think that they eventually already have that hardware endpoint, which is essentially greater ubiquity of Rift headsets, where, I don't think they would introduce a phone at this point to kind of cover the gap from now till then. I think the gap covering is going to be done in a software approach through camera effects.
Okay. So they could, though, skip the phone altogether and say, hey, we see Apple and Google eventually coming out with AR glasses. We have Oculus Rift right now. We're going to go for the glasses, Oculus glasses, because at some point that's going to happen. And you can look back at the history of when the iPhone launched. Most people will probably recall the chairman and CEO of Google at the time, Eric Schmidt, I believe was on the board of directors at Apple. And Apple iPhones were using Google Maps. They were using Google Search as the default. And then over time, it became very, very competitive. And they still work together in many respects, but they're also very competitive. And I'm just wondering if we're going to see that play out in the next evolution of mobile devices, which could be AR glasses, with Facebook, because they seem like one of the most worthy contenders that could possibly, if anybody's going to do it, it would be them.
Yeah. So you're asking that Apple could kind of put up some barriers for Facebook to be present in the App Store and on their devices because they're getting competitive?
Well, I don't know.
Or is
so much.
Facebook going to build glasses?
Right.
I think that might be the question. Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting question. And that gets to like some of the definitions of the hardware. So if you look at just pure VR, which they have in the Rift, and then you get into things like mixed reality, which kind of combines, that's HoloLens, and then you have merged reality. So merged reality is a form of mixed reality, but instead of having the world around you that you can see through transparent glass and then it has overlays, it's kind of the opposite of that. You're kind of fully behind a set of goggles, but then there is a camera that gives you pass through. So it's instead of graphical overlays on the real world. It's the real world overlaid on the graphics. So it's interesting. So
Wow.
I think what Oculus could do in terms of like there's a spectrum of options, but the lowest hanging fruit for them is to simply take the hardware they have, which is the Rift, and have a pass-through camera to give them that more AR or MR based experience. Now that could be limiting too, because as we know, the Oculus Rift is so large, it's gonna limit the use cases if that's the hardware, because you can't wear it out in the street. So that gets to your question of, would a separate set of hardware that is more of a wearable glasses, socially acceptable type of piece of hardware, I think they could definitely do that, because they already have the software stack and they have all the technology. I think that they could work with some OEMs, some partnerships to basically complete the loop there and have a set of AR glasses that kind of coexists or is in that kind of Rift line. Maybe that's their brand. It's Oculus Rift, or maybe it's Oculus Rift and then Oculus Specs or something like that. So they have that product line that includes that spectrum.
Right. I know it's probably many years off before we would see that, if it does happen, but it's
totally. But it's fun to
think
speculate.
About. It is.
Yeah.
It is. And I know, you at Artillery, though, if we circle back, you're definitely more focused on looking at what's happened over the past few months, what's going to happen in the next 1, 2, or 3 quarters to help companies plan for that. So I've taken us a little bit off track there.
Yeah, I love it.
One company that we haven't discussed much, and we could probably save this for another episode to have you back on, but let's touch briefly on Google. And, how does ARKit, since that's the theme of today's show, how does ARKit impact Google? What is Google thinking? How are they going to react to this? Because ARKit could make Apple just a complete dominator in augmented reality over the next 1-2 years if Google doesn't come up with something that's highly competitive. My guess is they will, but I'd love your perspective.
So at Google I/O, they launched some very cool stuff. One is VPS, Visual Positioning Service, which is GPS for indoors, and the second one is Google Lens, which is slightly different, but it's in a related family of immersive technology, which is visual search. So you point your phone at something and it'll tell you, like if you're out on the street, I'm pointing my phone at a pair of shoes and it says, okay, those are the Nike Air Jordan Classics. Here's a link to buy. Here are a number of images. So, it's essentially, Google's in an interesting spot. In the smartphone era, one thing that they've suffered from is a loss or a reduction in search query volume. And that's the basis for their business model, is how many people are searching. And that happened in the mobile device because people are searching less. We're spending more time in apps as opposed to the browser, where kind of search is the front door. So from that, they've been looking to counterbalance that decline in search query volume with other ways to get people to search. So one of those is voice search, for example. We're seeing voice search rise from Google and Siri and Alexa and all those, and that's kind of a side note. But this kind of visual search is yet another way that I think they're going to start to get people to search. And one classic example is, you hold your phone up to a storefront and it'll tell you, that's Joe's Pizza. They're open right now. Here are their specials. So that's one thing that I think that Google's doing that's interesting. Now, back to VPS, the Visual Positioning Service, that's also very interesting. And that gets back to what I alluded to earlier of the ability for consumers have navigation indoors and be a true utility for finding things in stores and in retail settings. But for Google, it's interesting. This is the part I don't hear about a lot, but I think it's true. It ties back to their model in being able to attribute kind of behavior in the real world and that last mile to the cash register, which has always been this big fog that no one knows what's happening in terms of attribution. If Google can prove that someone kind of walked down this aisle, grabbed something, then went to the cash register, they can tie it back to a search marketing campaign and say to that advertiser, look, we didn't just produce a click, and the click was the KPI for years and years. We also produced a visit to a store and a cash register that went ding. So I think that ties back to their reasons behind all this and what they're doing. Now, to your question about their competitive dynamics with Apple, I think that right now Apple has an edge for the reasons I mentioned earlier, in that they're taking a software-based approach that makes it compatible with a lot more existing phones, as opposed to Google in the Tango world, where it's only really compatible with a handful of phones like the Lenovo Fab 2 Pro and a few other units. I think that'll change over time in the kind of 2.5-year hardware replacement cycle. A lot of the componentry required for Tango, that kind of high-end optics and depth sensing and all that, like Moore's law will drive down the price of those components, and we're going to start to see it as a just standard feature in all kinds of Android phones. So at that point, so long story short, the Apple iOS universe is going to have the edge in the short term, but the Android universe globally is actually larger. So eventually, I think Google could leapfrog the capability in terms of the amount of phones it has out there that can do all this. But it's going to be an interesting horse race to see all that come together.
I think, as you mentioned, so Google has a much different strategy of approaching the AR world and how they're going to monetize it than Apple does. Very different in that respect. And then even as we circle back and talked about, Facebook and Snapchat, which has a much more social strategy, all the players in this field have a little different angle, and it could be that all of them win in some respects, right?
And you bring up a great point that, like, not just the what and the how and all the kind of the technology and how it's going to like find its way to us and what it's going to do, but the why. I love the question of why. Each of these guys are going about this and really blitzing augmented reality and virtual reality for different reasons. Apple is, they make all of their money from hardware sales. That's where their very healthy margins lie. So their reasons for all this is to make the iPhone sexy again and to move more units. So iPhone sales have actually been waning over the past several quarters. Facebook wants to keep you within Facebook, which is how they make money through advertising. So this kind of AR adorned social sharing of pictures and things is their way to get you to kind of stick around longer. Amazon, as I mentioned, they're using AR as a way to kind of increase basket sizes and reduce returns, which kill their margins. Google, as I mentioned, they're going about it as a way to kind of protect and boost their search business and kind of bring them into the next era to be part of all of that and make sure that their search business doesn't die. And then Microsoft. We haven't talked a lot about Microsoft, but they're very much blitzing all of this. And the why for Microsoft, I think, is interesting and open-ended. But one thing that Microsoft's doing that I think is interesting is they're gaining that vertical integration that Apple has always enjoyed. Their major rivalry throughout the computing history has always been Apple, and Apple has always had that edge of vertical integration because they own the hardware and the software. Microsoft now owns the hardware. They have things like HoloLens, and they have the operating system, and they have the application layer in Windows Mixed Reality. And then lastly, they're kind of hedging their bets. They're going for that vertical integration, but also their classic licensing model where they're taking that software, Windows Mixed Reality, and licensing it to third parties like Acer and Lenovo to build standalone VR headsets. So for them, the why is kind of, I think, increasing their reach. So that question of why I love, because it's like each of these guys are competing with each other, but for their motivations internally are each different.
Yeah. Well, you've tapped on several other subjects, and I'm sure we could talk for another 3 hours. We're going to wrap it up today, though, but I'm loving this discussion. I think we're going to have you back on the show in the not-too-distant future to talk more deeply about some of these other companies and their strategies. I do want to thank you for what you're doing for the industry. I have been thoroughly impressed with what you've been putting out with Artillery. We should probably mention that those reports that you're putting together are available through a monthly subscription through the VR&AR Association. Anyone who is a member of the VR&AR Association receives a pretty significant discount on those, which is a great benefit. But maybe you could talk just for a minute as we wrap up here about what those reports are and kind of where they're going over the next year.
Monthly reports, they're white papers that are a combination of data and insights. And the goal really is to educate anyone that's kind of moving into AR from adjacent industries in traditional media, anyone that's currently in AR already, tech companies and startups, to really just kind of have the advantage of a knowledge position as they look for different kind of gaps in the value chain and opportunities, and to really have a data-informed approach to doing that. It's a combination of monthly reports. We have an editorial calendar that's listed on the landing page on the VR&AR website. You can go there and go to the kind of resources tab and then the research subdomain, and you can see all about this. But briefly speaking, I'll say that the first report I put out in June, which we have as kind of a free sample, looks at the state of the art of virtual reality right now. What are the current unit sales? What are the success factors? Which headsets are selling the best and why? Which apps and games are having the most downloads and engagement and why, and what are the lessons that can be gleaned from that. And then the second report I just did in July was all about that kind of rant I just did on all of those different players: Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all of their disparate moves, how they all come together. And then next month I'm going to be looking at some consumer data, some really telling consumer survey data that I did in partnership with Thrive Analytics, which is a survey research outfit. And we looked at a lot of interesting findings about, who's in terms of consumers, who's adopting VR, who's buying it, why, those who aren't, why not. And I think there's a lot of good telling stuff in there.
Excellent. Mike, thanks again. This has been Mike Boland, the founder and chief analyst of Artillery, and we look forward to having you back on the show sometime in the not-too-distant future. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. This has been a lot of fun.
Listeners, whether you are new to the scene or a seasoned VR vet, you'll have a blast in Arkiak's newest VR title, Smashbox Arena, which is actually available now on the PlayStation VR. Enter the arena with up to 5 other players from around the world and face off in team-based dodgeball-like combat, dive into cover, dodge enemy shots, crush the competition with some insane power-ups. So get ready, set, smash. And for those of you who don't know, Arkiak is a full-service VR studio which is located in Vancouver, Canada, that specializes in creating VR content for gaming, enterprise solutions, and are the producers behind CVR, which is the largest VR, AR, MR conference in the Pacific Northwest. So for more information about Smashbox and Arkiak, visit arkiakvr.com. And again, that's ARCHIACTVR.com. So thank you all again for listening, and please make sure to share your feedback on this episode to podcast@thevrara.com, and make sure to visit thevrara.com to see what it is that's going on with association events that are coming up near you. In the last newsletter that I received, I counted about 28 events that are coming up in the near and distant future, so make sure to get signed up for this weekly newsletter to stay on top of what all is going on in the industry. And until next time, have a great day no matter where you are in the world, whether real or virtual.